Now, the Auditor-General has published its second report on COVID-19 spending in South Africa, showing significant faults in procurement and contract management processes of government's COVID-19 spending. Tsakani Maluleke acknowledged that in response to the pandemic, government had to react quickly and decisively in uncertain times in an already compromised control environment. So those are some of the issues that the Office of the Auditor-General has identified as having contributed then to the malfeasance and corruption. Before we get into the Auditor-General, I'm joined now by independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, before we talk about the Auditor-General, because that's going to form the bulk of our conversation, I wanted to just touch on this news that has come in late from the Zondo Commission of Inquiry tonight around McKinsey coming forward and saying it'll pay 650 million rand, but it only comes after the commission has showed them documents of corruption that took place related to regiments. Do you think that this is something that could have happened a long time ago?
Yes, I do think that obviously it would have been much better to do this earlier, but I think from what we've been observing, the crux of the money flows testimony at the Zondo Commission has been happening over the past couple of weeks. And of course, that may be simply as a result of how long it took to try and connect all the dots about where the money went and who benefited from what. So it's not surprising that entities like McKinsey now being confronted with the hardcore evidence detailing exactly where the money went and how they're implicated have opted to then pay back the money. I think some people have been saying that it's reflective of high ethics within the McKinsey stable. That is not an argument that I buy into. I do not believe that an ethical organization would have allowed this entire process to drag on so far, only to relent once they were given the type of evidence that became irrefutable. They knew that they'd taken the money.
Khaya, you're bringing me to my next point, right? Because the suggestion here is that McKinsey would have waited for the evidence from the Zondo Commission in order to see where things went wrong and therefore almost be able to acknowledge that, in fact, there was some wrongdoing. But for a company and an entity like McKinsey, can we really accept that they didn't know there was anything wrong with the transactions that they were entering into over a period of a number of years, especially when we look at the kind of concessions that they've already made where Eskom is concerned?
Well, McKinsey is in the business of telling you and I and every other business where things have gone wrong. So McKinsey is not unaware of how to actually identify issues that need rectification. That is exactly the business that they're in. So the idea that they could have been unaware of what went wrong is not something that I buy into. The one possible limitation is that by the time you start investigations of this nature, we know very well that the very first thing that happens is that the people that were at the center of it tend to walk out of the door. Now, of course, for some companies, that might make it even more difficult for them to actually even internally dig up and try to track the type of information that is necessary. I think we saw the example of EOH. They had to bring in forensic auditors because all the people that had actually been part of the state capture transactions had left the company. So in some cases, the delay is only because the company itself, its best intentions notwithstanding, is unable to piece together the dots if all the people that were part of it have left. But I think in the case of McKinsey, their systems are so sophisticated and their brand so strong, it is not acceptable to even think that they couldn't figure out what had happened until the Zondo Commission gave them the invoices, particularly when the money went into their bank accounts, or at least was tracked through their financial systems.
Okay, it's going to be interesting to hear then the evidence that is expected from some of the officials at McKinsey at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry tomorrow. Let's come back then to today's second phase of that investigation into COVID-19 funds by the Auditor-General's office. I suppose there were some slithers of hope in the sense that, yes, corruption has taken place or malfeasance or whatever it is that you want to call it really. But some of the interventions from the first report and the recommendations seem to have been implemented, which is helping in the recoveries of some of those monies, at least at the UIF.
I think the implementation of a live audit is a remarkably critical intervention from the Auditor-General. And I think most people do not understand the distinction between a live audit and a normal audit. A normal audit, Kathy, is something that happens months after the year end. It could be our financial year ends in December and the audit starts in February. Now, of course, if it's February, it means that we are now trying to track transactions that happened in January the previous year. So that means that by that time, most of the money is gone. So what live audits do differently is that they narrow down the time frame between the transaction happening and the auditing thereof. And we can already see the benefits of that in relation to UIF. Because you started the live audits, it meant that even if Kai had been paid in error in the first month of the UIF's payouts, in the second month, now that you know that he's been red flagged as someone who probably shouldn't be participating in this, you would at least stop the second payment, and that's how the saving goes. But I think this went even further in that they've actually recovered an amount of money of up to 3.4 billion rand, which I must say is something unprecedented in the public sector. The Auditor-General reports, and people never bother to pay back the money.
It's interesting because one of the things that we also heard Ms. Maluleke saying today, Kaya, was that even though they've been doing these live audits within just the short period of time, there were still documents that were missing. There were still things that they were unable to locate within a 30 to 90-day period. I mean, does this mean that people are deliberately hiding information? They're deliberately stealing money and still hoping to get away with it?
So what tends to happen is that we've got two paradigms. One is what I call the sins of omission, and the other is what I call the sins of commission. And the difference between the two is that in some cases, people just don't know what type of documentation they should be asking for. So for them, it's simply a matter of, I've seen an invoice, I've seen a bank account detail, so therefore I'm going to make the payment, and they omit to collect all the data that supports the basis for that payment. So this is what you may refer to as the sins of omission. On the other hand, the sins of commission relate to people who see the documentation and then realize that actually, once this documentation is here, I do not have a justification for making this payment, and then still making the payment and then making the documents disappear. So you always have to try and distinguish which one of the two materialized or manifested in that particular transaction. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be gaps in relation to people who either do not know any better and still process transactions when they shouldn't, and people who do know better and simply say, well, let us destroy the audit trail and make it as difficult for the Auditor-General to trace these things as possible.
One of the biggest weaknesses also seems to be the fact that the different government systems, so the information that those at SASSA versus those at the UIF are working with, it's not integrated. It sounds like something simple, and to an ordinary person like myself, I'm thinking, well, why isn't it that when you put Kathy Mutlatlana's name in a database of government, all my information comes up regardless of which department is typing in that name? But practically, how difficult is it for SASSA to actually have information on those at the UIF and any other entities of government to prevent the payments that really, in some instances, should not have happened?
Well, if you look at the history, we actually have an entire agency dedicated to fixing this problem. So the State Information Technology Agency was created specifically to address the shortfall in that when you have so many different departments at national level and even at provincial level that actually harness the same data, that data should be able to speak to each other. So it should be easy for someone to see that, hey, Kathy has just applied for a UIF payout, but Kathy, according to SARS tax records, is actually a director in 3 companies because that data is linked to the CIPC. So it should be a process that should be initiated long ago. But unfortunately, what has happened in the state is that everybody has got their own budget in relation to IT development, for example. So every single department will say, we're going to go and put out a request for quotation on the market, and somebody comes and puts a proposal together, and then department 1 buys into it. The next day, the second department buys a completely unrelated product. So by the time you try to figure out, can these 2 departments integrate, it unfortunately materializes that the 2 systems do not talk to each other. And we do know that the institutional wisdom within the different departments is never strong enough for somebody to say, okay, here's what our system does. I've looked at the system there, so this is how we can get the interlinks. So that is something that has always been an issue in relation to the state. They've got a company that's supposed to fix it. It's clearly not doing its job, and we're now paying the price for it.
It sounds unbelievable to me, Kaya, that somebody who is a director of a company and doing work with the state would be able to qualify for a 350 Rand grant from SASSA and receive that money, when at the same time as the South African public were told that their background checks that are done on everybody that has applied, that people's bank accounts have been vetted, and those who've received even as little as 500 Rand from a family member have sometimes been disqualified just for the mere fact that there was money that came into their account.
The difficulty here is that if we need to be honest, one has to ask the question of, if you and I, for example, applied for a grant of 350 Rand, what would be the cost of the state trying to do the background checks that enable them to know that you and I do not qualify, for example? So I think in some cases, the unit cost of trying to do that type of data dig up meant that people were saying, well, let's just pay the 350 Rand. It's completely the wrong approach, but that is the type of shortcuts that people take out there, particularly when we know that there's a tendency to say, if you don't spend the money, it's going to get reallocated to another department. So you're better off spending it and then trying to get the documentation together. But the very idea that people who are not only directors of companies, but directors of companies that are actively in business and also doing work with the state, that really should not have been allowed to happen. So from the AG's report today, there were about 1,500 such incidences of directors who then said, not only am I a director in a company that is actively engaging with the state, I'm going to then apply for this particular grant. And once they had applied, the systems didn't red flag them and say, wait, this person has actually been registered on another database, whether it's a CIP SIM, so therefore this person shouldn't be there. So it is a catastrophic failure of managing just the data of 50 million citizens. So I think for a lot of people, it leaves them worried. And I think the problem, Kate, is that it happens both ways. There are the people that get paid when they don't deserve it, and then there are the people that deserve it and then get rejected on the basis that when somebody was capturing the data, instead of saying that I earn 100 Rand per month, for example, they put 1,000 Rand. I'm not in the room to correct that. So the system goes all the way and says, do not pay this person. And by the time we discover that, it's far too late down the line.
All right, independent analyst Kaya Sithole, let's leave it there for tonight. Thanks for coming onto the show.